Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome viewers to another episode of Pathways to Prosperity. And tonight we're joined by a special guest who was with us earlier on in the series, Mufti Umair Patel, Head of Sharia Compliance at Absa Islamic Banking. Mufti Sahab, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Mufti Sahab, one of the biggest topics that has been in the financial services industry through the past 10 years now has been cryptocurrency. And many people have made a lot of money on it. Many people have lost a lot of money on it. There's also been so much discussion around its Sharia compliancy, whether we can get involved in crypto or not. So tonight, inshallah, we want to discuss different elements of cryptocurrency with you, and we're definitely not going to be giving financial advice or investment advice. But maybe let's start off with the basics. For our viewers, for those people that don't understand this, what is cryptocurrency versus what is blockchain? Is it the same thing?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So I think, Ameen, I'm going to just reiterate one point that you made, that this is not financial advice.
Yes.
Because like you've made mention that many people have made money, many people have lost money. We are to look at it objectively from a Sharia perspective. And I think when we look at this word cryptocurrency, then we get caught in the technicality of what comes after crypto currency, because we familiar with currencies being the ZAR, US dollar, the pound, whatever it is, and we hear this crypto word and we say currency. So immediately when we look at it from a Sharia perspective, do we dive into its classification from looking at it as a currency, or rather taking it back, whether it classifies within the definition or it fits the definition of being classified as mal, mal, which would translate as wealth. So if we were to look at it, currency by the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
To interject you, I think that's important for our viewers to understand why that discussion is important, because in my understanding, the rules of currency from a Sharia perspective versus the rules of wealth from a Sharia perspective are very different. Is that correct?
Definitely.
Okay.
And I think that's a very important point that you make, is that when for something to be classified as currency, when we take a look at the word currency and we go back to the initial times of Islam, then currency, which was created as a medium of exchange, was but two things.
Okay.
Gold and silver. That was currency, and that was Mufti Taqi Sahab mentions that is what was created as currency, and he refers to it as thaman khilqi. That was created as currency. Now we find that the fiat currency and what the governments introduce, etc. But when we look at cryptocurrencies, do we classify it as a currency from a Sharia perspective, or does it classify as mal, as wealth from a Sharia perspective? This is something that if we were to define mal and we go back to our sources, which is the Quran and Sunnah, then we look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to mal in the Quran, but He does not define it.
Right.
Mal has not been defined. And this is where the jurists have defined mal and what is mal. And we would look at mal, we find there's plenty definitions in the books of jurisprudence and the books of fiqh. But if I were to define it, something which the people have an inclination towards, it can be stored, that is something that would classify as mal.
So would it be Allah? Of course, our aqeedah is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Hakim. He is the most wise, right? So of course, by Him not defining what mal is, He left it wide enough because it may change over time based on what you're saying. Depending on the society, depending on the culture in which you live in, depending on what are there as base commodities in that particular geography, mal may mean something different to a different people. Is that correct? Would that be fine for me to say?
I think we could say that the application of Sharia is dynamic.
Right.
The application of Sharia is dynamic, hence we find that Allah in His wisdom had given us the source, the word, and we would then apply it in its various forms using the framework that has been set out by the Sharia through Quran, Sunnah and Ijma.
So give us some example, Mufti Sabs, of fuqaha through the ages. What have they classified as mal or wealth?
Yes. So I think that is important for us to understand. Is mal or wealth only that which is tangible, or does intangible, because that is one of the base arguments or questions that you would find, that how would cryptocurrencies be compliant when it's intangible, when
Right.
it's something that on the computer or something in a cold wallet. What is it and how it's intangible? I can't touch it, I can't feel it. So I think if we look from time that the fuqaha discuss the selling of rights,
Okay.
fuqaha discuss the selling of oxygen, fuqaha discuss, in today's time we find that software is something that's sold, airtime, airspace is something which is owned. So all these different items we find that even though it's intangible in nature, it still holds the classification of mal within Sharia. Why? Because it is something that people have an inclination to, they can relate a price to it, and they're able to quantify that and attribute a price to it. So similarly, when we go into this cryptocurrencies and we look at cryptocurrencies, then we'd find that this is something which is becoming norm, a custom amongst the people from a Sharia perspective,
Right.
which is becoming something which can be stored. There is possession of it, and it holds value because you can part ways with it by selling it off at a profit, or you can make money through it. So from that perspective and looking at it from that angle, that this would be something which would classify as mal from a Sharia perspective. But then I think it's important to note that cryptocurrency is a very broad word, and there's been, I think, an introduction of over, I speak under correction here, but maybe in the millions of projects that have been introduced to this blockchain, this underlying distributed ledger that we talk about. So cryptocurrency is one thing, blockchain technology is another thing, and then the introduction of coins and tokens on the blockchain has been also something which is a large number of tokens had been introduced. Now from a Sharia perspective, we need to look at it very objectively, that yes, you find tokens or coins which are currencies.
Right.
You can take Bitcoin, for example, use it to pay for services, use it to buy items, you can use it and get fiat in return. There's ATMs that offer those kind of services. So this is where we find there's currencies that would be classified XRP, Litecoin. These are things. Then you'd find utility tokens, meaning if you hold rights to that tokens, like you'll find, I think, MakerDAO. It's part of the DAI network. So these are utility tokens. The people that hold Maker, they're able to govern and do work for this protocol. So that holds a different Sharia ruling. Then you'll find asset-backed tokens, like people that would want to do crowdfunding. So they'll create a property, or there's a property they'll purchase, create some nominal amount of tokens, and each token holds a share in that property. So and then you'll get revenue backed tokens. The protocol was created to raise capital, and I think that you'd be very familiar with when I say raise capital, and then obviously you'll share in the revenue that's generated through that company. So these are now all we see that it's advancing from one phase to another phase, and each of these tokens will hold a different ruling from a Sharia perspective.
Mufti, we can see that universe is deepening. You've mentioned it, right? But I want to hone in on one particular concept, which I think is important to the discussion. We started off by classifying within the Sharia, you have this idea of mal, or something that is categorized as wealth or an asset, and then you have sarf, which is currency, something that is classified as currency. But if I were to be so bold to say that mal can function as currency, and maybe sometimes this is why the conversation gets so difficult or complex within this environment, because if we look at gold is categorized as mal, it's a zakatable item on your balance sheet, but it can function as currency, and it did function as currency. In your opinion, do you see cryptocurrency in similar fashion, where it can be categorized as mal, but it doesn't mean that it can't be seen as legal tender across the world as currency?
From a Sharia perspective, the importance was that if we were to accept it, or we were to look at it or pass ruling on it from a Sharia perspective, then we needed it to be one of two things, either currency or mal.
Right.
Currency has very stringent, like you mentioned earlier, currency has very strict rulings for it. So obviously
and
we look
to ensure that we don't introduce riba.
Correct.
So I think this is very important for people to understand the rules of currency and for FX trading. Everybody is so involved in FX trading. It's because we need to eliminate riba from the transaction. Maaf, Mufti Sahib, I interjected you.
No, I think it's important, and I think when we speak, so now for it being classified as mal, or it can fit within the category of mal, obviously it comes with a lot more subjective or objectivity that it needs to be looked through from a Sharia perspective and screened through for Sharia compliance. But yes, once it classifies it as mal, then definitely can classify as a currency as well, provided that it becomes a custom and it becomes acceptable, like we see it's happening where people says you can buy bread or you can buy milk with your cryptocurrency, and it's being introduced as such. So now it's becoming accepted as a I wouldn't say legal tender, because yes, some countries have regulations around it and the likes, but you'll find that other places would introduce it through regulations as a medium of exchange, and yes, that's when it would serve as a currency as well.
Mufti Sahib, I suppose the big discussion, maybe towards the tail end of the discussion as our last question, an important consideration would then be, what is the zakatable status of cryptocurrency? Because if I've got cryptocurrency on my balance sheet, personal balance sheet, either in a wallet or in a cold storage or whatever the case may be, what is my zakatable state on this crypto?
So definitely it is a zakatable asset, and zakat will be paid on those assets on your zakat date. And the calculation, like we do for everything else, is that we put a rand value to it, given that where we live in, we put a rand value to everything that we hold and everything that we own. Similarly to the crypto holdings, or similarly to the crypto assets. I refer to it as crypto assets rather than currencies. So to the crypto assets that we hold as well, we would put an amount to it, and zakat will be calculated on that day.
Mufti Sahib, last question from my side. Would it be correct for me to say that if people are engaging, again we're reiterating that we're not giving investment advice or financial advice, we're more interested on the Sharia side of it. But would it be correct for me to say that if people are engaging in cryptocurrency, then there is an element of Sharia compliance that they must look out for on the underlying coin itself? Is it correct for me to assume that there would be some tokens or some coins that are compliant and some that wouldn't be compliant? What would be the distinguishing factors that people would be able to look out for?
So I think in my research and doing research in this aspect or in this regard, I've not yet found in one place where all the rules from a Sharia perspective have been penned down or penciled down in that regard. So I would suggest rather that when involving yourself in this market, it would be very important to identify a scholar who understands the changing markets or understands the dynamic world of cryptocurrencies and is able to advise appropriately from a Sharia perspective, because you would find there would be just one is the cryptocurrencies itself, but then you'd find other elements like staking, you'd find other elements like NFTs, you'll find this whole host, because it's a world and a realm on its own. So definitely I think my advice would be that you associate yourself, if you are involved in this place or in this space, not from a financial perspective but rather from a Sharia perspective, is to get the correct guidance and the correct steer, because definitely, like you mentioned, that there are elements that need to be considered for its Sharia compliance and others which are not Sharia compliant.
Musab, Jazakallah khair for that. I think for me, viewers, ending off with the words of Mufti Umair, I think it, for me at least, it increases my appreciation for scholars who have specialized in Islamic finance and the fiqh around the commercial transactions in Islam and Islamic economics, because as the world is progressing towards an artificial one and you're becoming phygital human beings, we need to constantly vacillate between this physical domain that we live in and the digital domain that we live in. And in that complexity, we need to ensure that we maintain the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and don't breach any of His boundaries, inshallah. We make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us within His boundaries, so we always live within His rada, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.